hit a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak. 4, 3, 2, 1. Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through every mistake, failure, and explosion that made modern space exploration possible. We are your hosts, Quinn,
Chris,
and a rat that looks like Chris,
and today we're going to be talking about BION, the program that PETA killed.
amongst other things.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so what do you guys know personally about PETA?
They just love killing things.
Yeah, and for listeners, for the
and-
sake of clarity, that is PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, the big name animal rights group with a whole lot of skeletons in its closet.
Not all of them human.
How many people do you think PETA has killed?
I
More
don't
than
know.
one.
I have to wonder if a lot of those like models that they pay for the stunts, if they also don't get like euthanized after. I'm gonna cut that.
I can see them swatting people as well.
Yeah.
And also just they run kill shelters, which is pretty horrific.
So what if I told you that on top of all of that, they also killed a space program?
That's another notch in the belt, baby.
Yeah.
And they probably liquidated all of the animals assigned to it.
We're gonna get to that. Hold that thought.
No,
Yeah.
please.
They turn them into a milkshake and they drink them.
I hate you.
Yeah, so this is and this is also probably going to be on the shorter end of our episodes. I just wanted to have something quick to put together to release in between some of our bigger series that we have planned and kind of get back to what we know. And if anything is like a security blanket for us on this podcast, it is space animal experimentation and horrible things happening to cute animals.
Thanks for putting it that way.
You know, it's getting back to what we know. And to kind of put this out in front of everything, I think it's fair to say that everyone on this podcast is very pro-animal rights. Like a full third of our content so far has been talking about various inhumane and unethical animal experimentations done by different space programs. And we're going to be talking about a bit of that today, so I guess this can also be a content warning. At the same time, in going after PETA, what I'm trying to say is that we are not against animal rights, maybe just against the idea that PETA should be the people championing it.
They're more corporatist than they are a grassroots animal rights movement.
Right.
Don't they spend like a good portion of their income on advertising and not actually on helping animals?
Yes.
That's what I hate the most about them. You can generate so much more good by donating to your local shelter than to
Also,
PETA.
I thought it was like a generally understood thing at this point. I mean, maybe this is just my age speaking now, but like,
No, they have an amazing
I
PR
thought that it was like a
campaign.
generally understood thing at this point that PETA is a piece of shit.
Yeah, and okay, that is something else that like I feel like most of our target audience already knows about PETA. They have taken a very hard series of like well-deserved PR blows lately.
But they still have a fantastically well-funded PR department.
Yes, and a lot of followers. And the period that we're going to be talking about whenever we get around to PETA, this is them kind of at their peak. And then over time, thankfully, that charge has kind of been taken up by actual like good people who, weren't killing dogs.
Like the Animal Welfare Institute, for one. I cannot stand PETA just because they profit off of your donations.
You're going to hate them even more. Don't worry. I have plumbed the depths of the internet to find new reasons to hate PETA.
Ah, yes, no longer just from an ethical perspective to have hatred for them, but a scientific perspective.
However, at the same time, again, content warning, we are going to be talking about a lot of horrible stuff happening to animals. As far as sources for today's episode, the main thing that I have been quoting is the book Animals in Space by Brian Burgess and Chris Dubbs. It's a very good book. It's a very fun read.
Cosmos 110.
So, where our story starts is in 1966. So this is 5 years after Yuri Gagarin has already launched into space. Manned flights are already a thing. The Soviets had already launched 8 manned missions in total, and they had evolved from the old Vostok spacecraft into their new Voskhod spacecraft. So this is the spacecraft that would be used for like the world's first spacewalk. But the Soviets had bigger plans for it. The first 2 missions Voskhod had flown, they only lasted a day each. This was a problem because the Soviets weren't really confident that the Voskod's life support system could actually keep a pair of cosmonauts alive for 20 days. If you remember back to our Space Gun episode, it was during Voskhod 2 that the spacecraft sprung a leak and its automated systems compensated by flooding the spacecraft with so much oxygen that it gave both cosmonauts oxygen poisoning.
That's actually kind of just weird to think about. Just, yes, I have been poisoned with the thing I need to live.
Whenever you get down to it, too much of anything can be bad. And yeah, oxygen poisoning is a very real thing. So, that is the Voskhod spacecraft, and that happened just a few hours into the second Voskhod mission. And going forward, they want to run these missions out, they want to do lunar missions with these things. They want this thing to be going for, weeks and months. So
they needed to have longevity to keep up a crew of, even more than 2 people, which is going to tax the system further.
Kind of like in the US, there were rival programs going at this point. The Soyuz spacecraft, the one that would eventually win out and become the very long-lived spacecraft we know today, that was competing with Voskhod for the right to be the one that took people to the moon.
Oh, wait, they were competing?
Yes. The Soyuz was considered the new, fancy, and expensive option. The Voskhod, which was based off of old technology, was considered the cheap and reliable option.
Huh. I always thought Soyuz was just the planned successor, too.
It turned out to be that way.
Okay.
But in the same way as there were plans for Gemini, the Gemini spacecraft, to go around the moon, if they could get away with it, they would have used the Voskhod because it was much cheaper.
And it was a known system.
They have a spacecraft. They've tested it for a day at most, and they want to plan it out to a month. And they don't want to do this if it'll, kill their cosmonauts. So this is where we get the mission Cosmos 110. So this was a plan to test the Voskod's life support by launching it on a 22-day mission with a pair of space dogs. And this is actually where they ran into another problem, because the Soviet space dog program had been shut down in 1961, 5 years earlier, and most of its surviving candidates had been either adopted by scientists or just handed over to foreign diplomats.
There are no space dogs available.
No. In fact, on the foreign diplomats thing, the Kennedys were actually given one of Strelka's puppies. So Strelka was a space dog. Yeah, and she had puppies. And this becomes a thing for the Soviets. They actually start handing out space dogs as little loot bags for different foreign diplomats.
Please don't call a dog a loot bag.
So Strelka had a puppy called Pushinka, which just means fluffy, and they gave it to the Kennedys. Yeah, I don't have a picture, but it is a very cute dog.
Do you think that Pushinka was Kennedy's Manchurian candidate?
Are they just going to Winter Soldier this dog?
You're right in that they suspected it, because as soon as they got the dog back to America, they heavily searched the dog. They ran it through x-rays and all kinds of stuff to figure out did the Soviets put a listening device in this puppy? Is that something they would do?
In recording chat, Belka and Strelka, and a man with a mustache and an untrustworthy expression.
Oh yeah, we're gonna talk about that guy one day, because he is
of course you know who that is.
His deal was basically he was the Soviet scientific representative. Anytime they announced a big burst, he was the guy to do it. But he also famously knew nothing about rockets. Then he was being shown around Baikonur by Sergei Korolev, and he at one point just asked the dumbest possible question. He pointed at a rocket and asked, "Where does the satellite go?" And Korolev just kind of reportedly stared at him for 10 seconds and then just said, "On top."
Are you saying he short-circuited Korolev?
Basically, yeah. And I can't remember what his field was. He was an actual, he was a good scientist in his field, but around this time, he became the Soviet, space spokesman. They basically had the same problem as with Gagarin, where, this dude would just start talking about shit.
And you would have to shut him up.
He would either, go off script or say, yeah, we landed on the moon yesterday.
The man is just at a state conference and they just caught his mic and he's just yelling loud enough for everyone to still hear.
Anyway, the dog program is over. They did not have trained space dogs handy, and they didn't have time to train any new ones. And the solution they landed on is basically something right out of an 80s action movie that I love. They tracked down 2 veteran space dogs, Veterok and Ugoliok, and brought them out of retirement for one last job.
These 2 dogs, they're just fat and old. We need you to have your Rocky montage so we can launch you up in the rocket. Good chance you won't come back.
So yeah, they want to bring a couple of veteran space dogs that have been adopted by scientists. Like, it has been 5 years since these dogs were like actually space dogs, and they take them out of retirement to put them on Cosmos 110 to test the Voskhod spacecraft for a 22-day mission. And figuring that they could also kill two birds with one stone, the Soviets also decided to use Cosmos 110 to test long-term exposure to space radiation by putting the spacecraft in a much higher orbit than normal, where the dogs would get exposed to about 500 millirad per day, which is 25 times more than any cosmonaut ever got. But yeah, this is a lot of radiation over a longer flight than anyone in history, or any spacecraft, any living thing in history had ever experienced. Now, the mission launched fine and reached its target orbit properly. That's when things started to go wrong. True to what the scientists were worried about, Cosmos 110's life support system broke down bit by bit. By the 20th day, the air inside the capsule had gotten so polluted that it forced them to actually abort the mission and bring the dogs home early.
They survived?
They did survive, yeah.
Yes!
They lived.
They lived.
With no complications?
Hold on, I didn't say that.
No.
They survived, and they were flown back to Moscow for the traditional space dog press conference. This is something they've done with every single space dog mission. From Animals in Space, quote, "Such press conferences had long been standard procedure during the 15-year period of the program that launched numerous dogs on suborbital and orbital flights. It made for an impressive show to have the cute canines prance and pose for the new photographers, demonstrating that spaceflight was safe and that the Soviet Union did not mistreat its canine cosmonauts. However, a different scene unfolded on this occasion. The two dogs, Vedorok and Ugolyak, had just been whisked back to Moscow from their landing spot in central Russia after a 22-day flight, and they appeared weak and tired. Ugolyak tried to nap during the press conference, while Vedorok wobbled on her feet and could only stand with the help of a laboratory assistant. Although exhaustion might have been expected after their ordeal, their fatigue masked more troubling indications of how long-duration flights affected animal physiology."
Oh no, they had ARS.
So yeah, the Soviets accidentally discovered the core pillar of all modern space medicine, that space hates the human body and will gradually destroy it in hundreds of wonderful ways.
I would argue it's not just the human body. I think it's all biology.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said human body there. It's that things have evolved to like gravity. Your bones like gravity. A lot of your digestive system, it really likes gravity. There is a whole bunch of ways that animal physiology changes when exposed to zero-G and space radiation over time. The biggest one that we will be talking about today is that over time, without gravity and without exercising, you lose muscle mass and you lose bone mass, which means that whenever you come back home and are exposed to 1G of gravity, astronauts often require long periods of physical rehabilitation just to be able to walk properly again.
All of those muscles that you don't think you use.
Not only suddenly not exercising them, but just being in zero-G. Even if you do modern exercise regimens will only they will slow the loss. You will still lose bone mass and muscle mass in space, no matter what you do.
They exercise the core muscle groups, yes, but do they exercise the smaller muscle groups that you just passively use throughout life on Earth?
They do attempt to. So there have been a bunch of different attempts over the years, and we will have separate episodes for this, but one of them, the Soviets tried basically a full body spring suit kind of thing that would make it a workout to literally do anything. Just move your arm, you would be pushing against the suit.
Huh.
Just to not only make it so that cosmonauts didn't have to waste quote unquote time out of their day for dedicated exercise, but also to try and hit those muscle groups that aren't covered by normal exercise. Muscles that get their exercise just from you doing stuff in your day. The Soviets discover that by launching these dogs on a long trip and then basically coming back just physically wrecked. So armed with their new knowledge that space was bad and cosmonauts needed to be protected from it, the Soviets created a new agency to deal with these new threats, the Institute of Biomedical Problems, or IBMP.
That sounds like a very sinister organization if you had no context.
It's honestly not. They're actually a very good organization, but I will say I love that they put the word problems in the name. I feel like a NASA or a Western organization would call it the Institute of Biomedical Research. But the Soviets just cut right to it. It's no, these are problems. We're going to call it biomedical problems. So, with its mission to keep space safe for cosmonauts, the IBMP worked on many missions, like the world's first space station, Salyut 1. But the bulk of its research actually went into a new program that started in the 70s to launch biosatellites. And a biosatellite is basically a pressurized spacecraft crammed full of as many experiments as would fit. Though every one of these biosats would get a generic Cosmos number, these would eventually form what is known as the BION program, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today.
NASA biosatellites.
Oh boy, here it comes.
Well, you're not having fun.
The first thing that I'm seeing is men in glasses looking at a monkey, and you're telling me NASA. I'm just going back through all of the monkeys.
All the Alberts.
Heaps of Albert.
Are you kidding? I'm going back to the French space program. Look at the top of that monkey's head.
Hold that thought.
Oh, no.
Now, around the same time, American scientists were coming to basically the same conclusion as the Soviets. They also aimed for longer-term missions and wanted to use test animals to make sure that Apollo astronauts didn't, wither and die on their way to the moon. But where the Soviets got an entire new research division, the late 60s saw a massive cutback of NASA missions as funding was slashed or focused entirely on Apollo. The most they were able to get approved was 3 biosatellite missions. So the idea with this was basically to ratchet up the mission length with each launch. The first biosat would fly for 3 days, the second would fly for 21 days, and the third would fly for like a full month. Unfortunately, the entire biosatellite program was filled with problems from the start. Biosatellite 1, which carried a collection of insects, eggs, and plants, reached orbit successfully, but the re-entry motors failed and the satellite spun out of control for 30 days before burning up, which also meant that they were not able to recover any data from it. To cover for the loss, and because the program was also having its funding actively cut, NASA scientists decided to make Biosatellite 2 just a full rerun of Biosatellite 1, only a 3-day mission. This time, everything went smoothly. Unfortunately, the only discovery the scientists could make from the samples is that 3 days is not long enough to really determine anything.
We performed all this research. What'd you get out of it? Yes.
Oh, we don't know.
The plant is still a plant.
The plant is not sludge yet.
And what all of this means is they still have the Biosatellite 3, which is planned for a full month. Unfortunately, the problems actually got even worse. So Biosatellite 3, instead of carrying a bunch of bugs and plants, it carried Bonnie. So Bonnie was a young pig-tailed macaque. And if you listen to our French Space Cats episode, you might recognize that species, because it is the exact same one the French launched. The pig-tailed macaque is also very endangered, and it will only get more endangered during our story. Fun fact, that is the second time in this series I have said those exact words. I hope I don't have to keep saying those exact words. It's just weird that it's happened twice, and that 2 separate space programs have decided to launch the same very endangered kind of monkey.
Probably because they heard that one other programmer was doing it and said, wait a second, I think they're onto something.
I'm going off of memory. I think that the French picked it originally because like, oh, hey, it's in one of our colonies, right? We'll just take them.
That, and they also picked it because it was known for being like very sociable, very trainable, and for forming strong bonds with its handlers.
Oh.
They picked it because it was around and because it was the nicest monkey. I don't know why specifically they picked a pig-tailed macaque, especially when America had a lot of experience before launching other kinds of primates, non-endangered primates. Like they had launched rhesus macaques, spider monkeys. They had launched chimpanzees by this point. Like Ham and Enos had already flown. This was a well-established thing. But yeah, they decided to go with Bonnie. To get him ready for his flight, Bonnie, as well as 4 control monkeys, were put through a battery of surgeries that made the French scientists look humane. He was instrumented with catheters, electrodes, and sensors for 33 different types of physiological data, and they didn't stop there. From Animals in Space, quote, additional pre-flight surgeries to prepare the animal for the flight included testicular biopsy, incisor tooth extraction, tail amputation, and anal suturing. I have no idea why any of those were done.
That
seems a little
scuffed.
Extreme.
I kind of get the incisor tooth extraction, maybe to prevent him like chewing through anything or hurting himself.
Yeah, that's
not quite the laugh line I was expecting.
I guess it's like they don't want the tail getting caught on something, and they don't want him spraying shit all over the equipment.
Yeah, but like other American monkeys got like cool space suits and they got to like wear diapers, I guess for a full month. They couldn't wear the diaper, like trying to just why did they do a testicular biopsy?
But like,
why are we rationalizing this?
It had to have happened for a reason.
Yes, but yeah.
Anal suturing the monkey's butt shut for our 20 to 30 day mission.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Which means he can't poop for a month.
Yeah. What if I told you it didn't wind up lasting 30 days?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Over under, I'm saying 17.
True to form, the problems only got worse. 5 days into the 30-day mission, Bonnie's health took a massive turn for the worse.
I can only imagine.
He stopped eating and drinking entirely. Also, at some point during the mission, he managed to get his arms free and started poking at the electrodes implanted directly into his brain.
Sir, Bonnie's vitals are flatlining. His entire body is becoming toxic. He can't poop.
He's reaching up to the electrodes in his brain and just like pushing it like a lever back and forth.
He found the pleasure button. He found the off switch.
Sir, Bonnie's fecal levels are reaching critical. It's reaching critical mass, sir.
He's gonna burst. Bonnie's health continued to deteriorate until they decided to abort the mission entirely and bring him home after only 8 days. From Animals in Space, quote, immediately after satellite recovery, attempts were made to revive the animal, but he was not responsive. Bonnie died 8 hours after recovery. He suffered marked dehydration, having lost 25% of his body weight. Although ultimately the cause of death would be attributed to over-instrumentation, at the time it was thought that the weightless environment alone led to his death. So 2 things. First off, over-instrumentation is what killed that monkey. They did so much surgery and added so many electrodes that is what killed him.
That scuffed picture you posted makes so much more sense now.
Yeah. The second thing is that NASA didn't know that. They thought that being in 0G for 8 days just like killed the monkey instantly.
Oh yes, the space.
Yes. And they had other problems. As you can imagine, all of this was horrible PR for an organization that was already having trouble justifying its actions and budget. Animal rights groups were incredibly pissed off over the extremely unethical treatment of Bonnie and the other. Again, there were 4 other control monkeys who went through the exact same thing. This was also about 10 years after America had launched Ham and Enos, the space chimps who paved the way for the first astronauts. And both of these chimps had been treated like crew surrogates. They were not treated just like living experiments. And whenever they got home, they literally became national heroes. So people knew that NASA could run a primate mission ethically, without lobotomizing the crew.
Without stuffing enough electrodes in their head to... I can't even make a joke out of that. That's just...
At the same time, NASA also caught flack from Congress, not for vivisecting an endangered species, but for not doing it well enough. See, as far as the government was concerned, the entire biosatellite program was a failure. NASA had spent tens of millions of dollars on 3 missions that, all failed 3 for 3, that gave no useful information and that did nothing to protect astronauts. NASA had nothing to show at the end of this. On the one hand, you have these animal rights groups that are basically asking, why did you do that to the monkey? And on the other hand, you have Congress who approved the funding going so did you learn anything useful from all of this?
I'm assuming it was, yes. And then, what did you learn? Yes.
We've figured out how many instruments it takes to kill an endangered species.
We know that we will not lobotomizing or anal suturing our astronauts for these types of ventures.
Neil, have I got the pitch for you? Also, by the way, this is after Apollo. This is after Apollo 11. American astronauts have done long-term space missions at this point, and they're still just we need to do this to the monkey. We have no choice at all, ever.
There's just someone in NASA that hates this exact breed of endangered monkey.
So the upshot of all of this was that NASA was pressured from both sides to find cheaper ways of protecting astronauts and to do it as humanely as possible. And because of this, around the same time, they had to cancel a different 2-monkey life science mission. Now, just as things looked their worst, NASA got a strange offer from their Cold War rivals. The Soviets were building a series of biosatellites and wanted experiments to launch absolutely free of charge, and they wanted America to get in on this new deal.
Boy, do I have a business proposition for you.
You have monkeys and nothing to do with them.
Soviet-American cooperation.
So by the time the Americans joined the BION program in 1975, the Soviets had actually already launched 2 of them. The idea was always to make it a big international partnership, though, and BION 1 and 2 had launched with experiments from all over the Warsaw Pact. The way this worked was that the Soviets had a big spacecraft with a lot of room and wanted to fill it with as many experiments as possible, getting the best bang for their buck. Since the Institute of Biomedical Problems didn't have enough experiments on their own, they basically offered the extra room to a bunch of other countries.
The ultimate ride-sharing program.
After the first 2 missions, the Soviets decided to open the program up even more and start taking in Western countries like France and the US. This might, and I want to be clear on this might not sound like a big thing, but this was pretty much the first start, this was pretty much the start of international cooperation in space between the US and USSR. And this would last for a full-on 20 years.
This is actually, it really is incredible. And that's just not me bullshitting. That is...
Yeah.
Wait, what year was that exactly?
They started cooperating in 1975.
And yeah, that is the Cold War still in swing.
Oh yeah. Apollo Soyuz has happened at this point, but that was really just like the two of them docked, they shook hands kind of deal. Yeah, this is the first actual example of space cooperation. Like these scientists work together at every phase of this process. Like they are exchanging data. Now, to a lot of life scientists, the Soviets' deal basically looked too good to be true. First off, the BION program wasn't meant to be a one-off mission. The Soviets scheduled a launch of these things for every 2 years and promised they'd keep launching them basically as long as anyone was interested. And the reason this is actually important for scientists is that it meant they could iterate on their experiments and get follow-up data from earlier missions. So like, if you launched an experiment and either something went wrong or you found a cool result, 2 years later, you could launch that same experiment. You could get some follow-up. You could make sure that it wasn't just a fluke. And this is the whole repeatability thing in science. And the BION program was specifically made to enable people to do this.
Be able to iterate on the past, ultimately be able to say, I call heads. And it comes down that.
The other thing that made the BION program so appealing was the fact that it cost basically nothing. BION partners didn't even have to pay launch fees. They only paid for the cost of building and shipping their experiments. The Soviet space program covered the satellite, the rocket, launch operations, orbit, recovery, and even shipping the experiments back to their home countries. In space terms, this made BION missions beyond dirt cheap. Like, this is legendary amounts of cheap.
You're literally just paying ship there. That's it.
NASA scientists estimated that fully running their own biosatellite missions would cost around $30 million a pop. BION flights cost them less than $1 million a piece.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah.
And all of that was coming out of the Soviet taxpayer.
Well, hold on, because if you think this was all some like big, incredible display of Soviet charity, it really wasn't. BION was incredibly cheap for them too, even with launch costs. So we've talked about the Vostok spacecraft before, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a sphere-shaped capsule that originally carried Yuri Gagarin and the first cosmonauts into orbit in the early 60s. So what happened was the Soviets actually thought they were going to launch a bunch more of these things. And whenever the program got canceled in 1963, they had a lot of old hardware sitting around gathering dust. And different Soviet space projects had limited funding, and they figured that a way that they could keep their costs down was to use all of these old Vostok spacecraft that were literally just sitting around and convert them into satellites for their programs. And the reason that this worked is because whenever you get down to it, once you carve out all of the cosmonaut stuff, the Vostok spacecraft is basically just a big 8-foot sphere that you can fill with all kinds of payloads. Over the decades, the Vostok formed the framework for the earliest Soviet spy satellites, which were called Zenit, remote sensing, resource, science, Energia, material science, photon, and the entire BION program. We're definitely going to have later episodes talking about this, about Vostok, but like they literally take this now 60-year-old spacecraft and just use it as the basis for so many of their earliest satellites. I cannot stress enough how much this one spacecraft has been launched and used, like hundreds of times.
I mean, the theory does hold up if you have a known quantity spacecraft or a known quantity equipment.
And Vostok has proven itself to be an incredibly reliable spacecraft as time went on. Unlike the later Voskhod, it's cheap, it's simple, it's just a big empty sphere. So all in all, you wind up with this like incredibly successful international cooperation that is costing no one money, really. Like, at least in terms of what they're normally used to paying. Like I said, NASA would pay 30 times what they did if they tried to do this themselves. So the Soviets have a biosatellite. They have a working program to reliably launch these science capsules and recover them. And they are basically giving away space on these satellites, again, for fairy tale levels of no money. But what actually clinched the deal for NASA was something a little closer to home. NASA didn't have any rockets and the Soviets did. Quote, "The Soviet offer came at a particularly good time for the Americans, as they were faced with a gap in NASA programs that would soon leave life science investigators without available satellite space for some 7 years, until the launch of the space shuttle. The Apollo lunar landing program had concluded in 1972. Skylab, America's first space station, had been home to 3 crews of 3 astronauts for increasingly lengthy science missions, ending with an 84-day manned mission before the station was abandoned in 1974. Biological experiments on the final flight had yielded no useful information because of a power failure. Evidence of the possible health risks associated with the spaceflight that had been accumulated by astronauts aboard Apollo and Skylab had raised many questions that life science investigators were eager to answer. Plant and animal experiments aboard the Soviet satellite would provide this opportunity. So, like, at the end of the day, you have this perfect set of circumstances that force these two programs to cooperate. The Soviets have this satellite, they're packing it full of experiments, and they just don't have enough experiments to fill it up. Like, they are wasting money. NASA, meanwhile, has no rockets. They're in a period where all of their old Apollo rockets are being used up and being taken out of service, and the space shuttle is still, like, years away. They have nothing. And not to mention the fact that NASA is also rapidly, like, getting its funding slashed, and this program offers them so much savings. Like, you can bet they take this opportunity the first chance they get.
Hey, you got monkeys in my rockets. You got your rockets in my monkeys.
Now, the first biosatellite to fly with NASA experiments was BION 3. Like, for the sake of this episode, I'm going to call them BION 3, but if you look these things up, because these were scientific research satellites, they didn't get custom names. They just got, like, Cosmos numbers. So the Soviets just gave these things, like, whatever number was next in line.
They got standard internal designations.
Exactly. But again, for this, I'm going to call them BION. I'm going to count them off. The satellite flew with experiments from France, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, America, and the Soviet Union. It carried a payload of 25 rats, 500 minnow eggs, a few hundred fruit flies, and a single Daucus carota sativus, which I had to look up. It's a carrot.
A carrot.
They launched with
Okay.
It was just they launched a carrot to see what would happen.
We just want to know if the carrot tastes the same after it gets back from space.
Do we have a control carrot back home? That would be a fun YouTube video. You could easily do, like, a double-blind test and get someone to identify the space carrot. Yeah, so they launched a carrot. They launched a bunch of rats. The idea was to expose half the samples to zero-G, while the rest sat in a centrifuge which simulated Earth gravity, and then compare them. So they had like the zero-G section, and then they had the centrifuge section above that. The satellite launched in 1975 and was scheduled to stay in orbit for 20 days, but bad weather at the landing zone forced them to land a day early. And once it hit the ground, it was met by a massive team of scientists with a fully mobile inflatable lab that could be set up in an hour. This is because freshness was one of the main scientific concerns for the scientists. They knew that animals would gradually reacclimate to Earth's gravity, so it was important to study them as soon as possible before they had a chance to regain that bone mass. Basically.
Yes, the space. No, it's before they lose the spaceness.
Yeah, you have to lock in the freshness
before they lose the space taste.
I knew we were onto something, lads. You were correct.
With that in mind, half of the rats were autopsied instantly, just on site in the inflatable lab. The others were not much luckier. They were flown back to Moscow with the minnow eggs and the carrot, and they were autopsied there.
They autopsied the carrot?
Yes, they took samples of the carrot. The reason why they also autopsied the carrot and took samples was because a critical part of the BION program was that all of the findings were meant to be shared between all of the scientists. Like, it doesn't matter what your experiment is. If you got your samples and you went home and did a year of research, you would then have to send your results back to the Soviets, who would farm it out. Like, everybody got all of the results. It was all shared. Every country was given a bit of every single sample. So the carrots were divvied up. The carrot was divvied up. The minnows were divvied up. It's from this that I know that the carrot was originally launched. Like, the carrot was American, but it then got farmed out to everybody else. It was an American carrot. And this is where things get a little bit weirder. After all of the rats were autopsied, what followed was a weird sort of auction, where, based on the contributions of their nation, different scientists would get first dibs over the rat parts that they'd get to take home. Because the Americans were the new partners in the program, they generally got the shittier rat meat, while scientists from Eastern Europe got all the good stuff. So yeah, this is what I was asking you guys about before. What is your favorite cut of rat?
What?
Okay, so I'm assuming, do we avoid the brain or not?
Oh, the brain is part of it. You can pick the brain.
Ooh, but there's material cereal in there. Ideally, you'd want a mix of light and dark meat for, counting absorption. Or radiation
and also
absorption.
Just taste. This is kind of like,
a scientist
to the American scientist, it is kind of like whenever you have the family, like whenever you go to Thanksgiving dinner and everyone lines up to go by the turkey station and you're last in line. you're left with the scraps. You get a tail. There you go, buddy.
But you also have bone in there that you can sample. Personally, I think it's the rat hanger steak is the apex of the art form here.
The best part, yeah. At the same time, they made use of every part of the rat. They were efficient with these things. Speaking of rats, as the BION missions went by, they played an increasingly large role in the experiments. The next mission, BION 4, replaced the minnow eggs and carrot with just a bunch more rats. Some squeezed into an artificial gravity centrifuge, while the others got to float in zero-G. So you can see a picture right there of the ratifuge.
The ratifuge.
That's just what I'm calling it, yeah.
My lightly spun rat.
But all of that is nothing compared to what NASA called the novel rat experiment that flew on BION 5. The scientists behind this experiment wanted to test rat embryology, i.e., their ability to breed in space. So what they built was basically a big box with a partition splitting it in two. 5 female rats occupied one section, while 2 males occupied the other. And then once the satellite reached orbit, they'd lift the partition up and, let the rats mingle. And as trivial as a lot of these tests sound, they were producing actual results. Quote, results from BION 4 indicated that creating onboard artificial gravity did ameliorate some of the negative effects of weightlessness. For instance, some of the muscle and bone anomalies occurring in the weightless rats did not occur in the centrifuged rats. Uncentrifuged flight rats aboard BION 5 suffered decreased bone formation, volume, density, and strength. Although all rats carried in the mating chamber remained fertile and active, no births resulted from the flight.
I feel sorry for my rats.
I'm still looking at the ratrifuge.
Yeah, and BION 5 also had a rat centrifuge and a non-mating zero-G rat. BION 5, as they went along, they started cutting out all of the other parts of BION and just made more and more and more rats. And every time they landed, all of these rats were then dissected and then put up for auction.
It's an evolutionary cycle, except for experimentation, where the ultimate destination is always rat.
It's instead of crab, it's just
the ratrifuge image is just immediately screaming to me engineering diagrams that look like shitposts.
Yes. And on top of the scientific data, the BION program was also providing NASA with an opportunity to train up whole teams of life science experts in preparation for experiments they'd eventually do on the space shuttle. Because people aren't going to hang around at their jobs if they don't get to do their jobs.
Yes.
BION is the only thing keeping the NASA life sciences team around. Because otherwise they'd just be asked to sit around and do nothing for 7 years. American and Soviet cooperation on BION continued all through the 70s, and while the program remained international and open to everyone, NASA quickly became the most valuable partner, and that also came with great perks. They were given more room in the satellite for their experiments and started performing joint experiments with Soviet scientists. And here's my favorite part, they even got to bump Eastern European scientists and pick the choiciest part of the rat, the long leg bones and calf muscles, which are apparently the best part of the rat.
I can see bones and muscles because radiation absorption for both.
Because you're dealing with muscle loss and bone loss at the end of the day.
I was going to say I have a fixation on radiation, and that's my problem.
It just happens to be the cut that's most tender.
I love that as a metric of friendship. Hey man, I appreciate everything you've done for helping me out with this space program. And you know what? You know how I'm going to prove this? You get first pick of the rat. You get to pick the rat.
Screw Kazakhstan, get up there.
Just shoving Polish and Czechoslovakian scientists out of the way to get to the rat table first.
The rat table. I refuse to believe that does not exist.
There's just a display case with a neatly disassembled rat on it.
What if it's a teppanyaki restaurant and they'll cut it up right in front of you? They just slap the rat on the table, slam the cleaver down. Yeah, and so that's one show of friendship, and possibly the bigger show of friendship is that BION continued after 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and the US shut down basically all research cooperation across the board. BION was the only thing to survive as the Cold War reached its next hottest point after, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I love it.
Yeah, maybe you disagree with their political decisions, but they got rat. And where else are you going to get rat?
Oh.
And if all of this sounds like the Soviets were being very nice to the Americans, it's because they were also getting a lot out of this cooperation, and they had plans for their future. While American scientists wanted access to space rat meat and cheap flights to orbit, the Soviets wanted American expertise on space monkeys.
The space monkeys.
Yeah, because back then, despite what we talked about with Bonnie, the Americans were the experts on space monkeys.
How dogs were the Russian things, how cats were the French thing.
They landed on primates. Going into the 80s, Soviet scientists wanted to expand the BION program to tackle more interesting problems and figure out exactly how zero-G would, what effects it would have on humans. They had sort of scratched the surface already with rats and dogs, but they figured that to get the best data, they'd have to do something they'd never done before. They'd have to launch primates. Now, we've talked in earlier episodes about the Soviet dog program versus the American monkey program and why the Soviets picked dogs. Basically, they thought they were more trainable. They thought even if the physiology didn't match the humans, that personality-wise they were closer to people. But that also meant that they didn't have decades of experience to call on, something the Americans did. Quote, according to BION project manager Kenneth Souza, NASA shared basic information from its own experience working with monkeys, even lessons in what not to do, such as over-instrument the monkeys. The Soviets took our lessons and learned from them, he said. So the first Soviet monkey flight was BION 6, which carried 2 rhesus macaques named Abrek and Bion. To round out the cargo, it also carried 10 pregnant rats. And they timed when the rats mated and got pregnant to see if they could give birth in space.
As if the stress of being shot into orbit wouldn't accelerate things.
Now, unfortunately, the animals did not get the chance. 2 days in, Bion's health took a turn for the worse, and the capsule was landed early in an effort to try and save him. Now, he died 3 days after recovery, although an autopsy found his cause of death was a strangled bowel, and it had basically they found no connection to the flight or even the implanted sensors. It was just, bad health luck.
Also a zero-G thing, probably.
No. He just had a strangled bowel that they hadn't detected earlier. A pair of monkeys named Vernie and Gordy were next up, flying in BION 7. Yes, and at the same time, yes, don't worry, they also flew it with a bunch of rats, as well as some newts. Quoting from NASA, the newts had parts of the front limbs amputated and their crystalline lenses removed to study the possible rate of human recovery from injuries incurred in space. It's important to note that newts can regrow their limbs and eyes. The reason why I'm not certain about this test is that humans cannot regrow their limbs and eyes, so I don't know what NASA was hoping to accomplish.
There's some level of regrowth that is possible, but on the scale that they're testing it.
Taken all together, BION 7, the mission was a success. It stayed in orbit for the planned week, and it returned safely. It also produced enough questions that BION 8 repeated pretty much the exact same setup. Monkeys, rats, newts. This time, however, one of the monkeys, Eurosha, actually got free of his restraints and started exploring the cabin and messing with the other monkey, Drielma.
Yes, one monkey has gotten out of its enclosure. It's time to start a slap fight.
And like a lot of missions, whenever they encountered this problem, they had to abort it early after just 12 days. Except because of a separate problem, it landed almost 2,000 miles off course in Siberia, and it took so long to recover that the Newt's aquarium froze solid.
For one, that's horrible, too. They should have kept it going to see the results of the zero-G primate fistfight.
Thankfully, both monkeys were recovered safely, and in the Soviet space animal tradition, Drielma was given to Fidel Castro as a gift.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, they make a tradition out of this. The Soviets frequently give space animals to just guys they like. Now, the last BION mission of the 80s, BION 9, was also the last Soviet biosatellite. Like the previous missions, it carried 2 monkeys, Zakonia and Zabiaka, 10 rats, and a collection of other animals. It actually set the record for the longest time a monkey has spent in space and carried experiments from 10 countries and the ESA, the European Space Agency. But like I said, this was also the last Soviet mission, and by the time BION 10 launched, the program would be very different.
BION in post-Soviet Russia.
So first off, you'll be happy to know that the fall of the Soviet Union did not kill the BION program. In fact, it actually made it bigger. When BION 10 launched in '92, it carried experiments from several post-Soviet countries as well as all of the other ones, it carried experiments from Ukraine and Uzbekistan. The biggest change for BION was that it stopped being like a Soviet program with some international partners thrown in, and it became a true Russian-American joint mission. So how this worked was NASA agreed to fully start covering half of all BION costs, which came out to around $15 million per launch. But this is still an amazing deal for NASA. Their costs have only gone up. $15 million is a steal.
compared to the 30 million they assumed at the start of the program.
That was back in 75. It would only go up. And the reason they had to do this cooperation was that Russia in the 90s was broke, and Roscosmos, the Russian space program, was in no position to maintain a program like BION alone. Now, even with the extra funding, the changes between the Soviet space program and Roscosmos introduced enough problems that they decided to launch the next mission, BION 11, like after 4 years instead of 2. So they needed a little bit of extra time. The changeover also introduced a new attitude towards quality control. And to give you an idea, I'm going to quote NASA Ames project manager Michael Skidmore. Quote, "The Russians found out that they were short 3 screws, so someone on their team found a box of parts, dumped them out, fished through them until they found 3 screws that fit, and we were back in business. At NASA, you can visualize a much more resource-intensive environment, where the screws would arrive in a certified container with a specific screw for each position and mounds of paperwork verifying each part's heritage back to the quarry." So, Soviet space standards were
lax.
This is worse. This is literally just like what do we have around?
Yes, find the bolt, find the screw.
And what, like, on the one hand, it's kind of cool, it's kind of based. We're gonna see later that there comes a point where, like, you want to actually do good reliability. You can't just use whatever you find.
Well, remember, this doesn't matter because they're animals, comrade.
NASA also had to deal with increased pressure from animal rights groups who wanted them to, like, stop all primate testing. PETA, and this is where we circle back around to PETA, PETA actually started a full-on PR campaign to lobby Congress to cut NASA's funding, and the crazy thing is they succeeded. Congress passed a bill that banned all funding for future BION missions. NASA was able to get it reversed in the Senate, and the only reason they did is because Senator John Glenn, who was the first American in space, stood up and gave like a 15-minute nonstop speech saying, like, no, you cannot shut down this program. This is important. He also pointed out that, like, a load of independent scientific boards had looked the mission over, like they'd gone over all the details and decided that it was both valuable and as humane as possible. PETA did not take this decision well. They gave up on the PR campaign and actually staged a protest where 7 members chained themselves to the door of the NASA administrator's office while he was away. They didn't know he was away. But despite all of the protests, NASA pushed on with the BION 11 mission. It launched on Christmas Eve of 1966 and carried 2 monkeys, Multic and Lapik. The missions were mostly uneventful. Both monkeys slept a lot. When they started to work on their motor tasks, which was basically touching a button in response to different lights lighting up, Multic was active while Lapik was lazy. Multic was actually so active that he accidentally smashed his control panel and couldn't do any more of his puzzles and didn't get any other food. The mission landed as planned 14 days later. After a quick recovery and checkup, the monkeys were flown back to Moscow, where a team of Russian, French, and American veterinarians was ready to examine them and take a couple of tissue samples. So this is actually noteworthy for a couple of reasons. This was the first time that American scientists were actually involved in these early tests. In the old days, this would be handled entirely by Soviet veterinarians, and the Americans would just get samples later. Second, this was the first time that the monkeys would go into surgery right away. Normally, they were given a week to recover before the vets would take tissue samples. But NASA scientists argued that that would mean that any effects of zero-G would be either lessened or just have a chance to completely wear off, and they didn't want that to happen. Unfortunately, this is where things went wrong. From Animals in Space, quote, "During a 2006 interview, Bielitsky vividly remembered the scene. The procedure on the 2 monkeys had gone smoothly and been completed. The monkeys were coming out of anesthesia, and the French vets were removing their scrubs. Bielitsky had just left the room to check on the status of the other animal when he was suddenly summoned back to find that Multic had been physically sick and aspirated some vomit. Frantic attempts to clear his airway and administer emergency drugs were ineffective. The condition quickly led to labored breathing and heart arrhythmia, and finally cardiopulmonary arrest. The animal died in my hands," Bielitsky said. So,
damn.
Yeah, not a laugh line, that one. A post-mission debrief found that exposure to zero-G had likely made the monkeys less able to handle the stress of anesthesia, and that performing the biopsies so soon after the mission was a, quote, unacceptable mortality risk. Since the upcoming BION 12 mission was meant to be an exact repeat of BION 11, biopsies and all, this set off a media firestorm. In April 1977, NASA put out a press release reading, "NASA is suspending its participation in primate research on the BION 12 mission." NASA pulled out, and in doing so, cut BION's funding in half. And with Roscosmos not being able to cover those costs, the entire program was shut down. So it all kind of falls apart pretty quick. They mess up on BION 12. They have the surgery too soon, like right after the mission, one of the monkeys dies and it just like the program falls apart right there.
I mean, part of it is still that rush for they were still in space. We have to lock in the freshness. It sounds like they did leave out the possibility that, hey, they could be weakened. They might respond to things differently.
Right. I don't know. Maybe like it's hard to nitpick because I don't know the science. I am not an expert. Maybe wait a day, you know? Like one day would not be enough for all of the
a day in controlled atmosphere. There you go.
Yeah, like let them get the anesthesia out of their system.
Or even a day in their pod out of space. Because that pod can still support them.
Or just find some happy medium between all of the like all of the spaceness is gone and they're still able to survive. And because the political scene was already primed to be very critical of this was the straw that broke the camel's back, basically.
Or the match that they were waiting for to light off the shitstorm.
Right. And this is another one of those things, like we can talk about this later, where like, yes, it is very bad what happened to the monkey, but at the same time, like,
if it had happened,
I personally do not know if it was worth the cancellation of the whole program.
Because you have to think of, if you want to get closer to human, the only ways up or the only ways forward are up or down. And it's either you send a human up into space, and that person that gets sent up into space is going to have an absolute hell ride upon return.
Yeah.
Or, even worse, they just die because monkeys are still significantly different from human beings. And they come back to Earth, they get treated like a monkey, and then, surprise, medical complications.
So a BION mission would fly again, but only after 16 years and without NASA assistance. So Roscosmos, like Russia, tried to restart the program a couple of times, and eventually they settled on a series of 3 satellites called BION M. So as you can see, this is basically still, like, despite all of the upgrades, it has solar panels. This is still just a Vostok satellite, like a Vostok spacecraft. They're still churning these things out.
Ultimately, if you know, so that's, I think, one of the cursed things about both science and manufacturing. If you have a known volume, people will just design for the known volume.
Right.
Even subconsciously, too, is the thing.
So BION 1 finally launched from Baikonur in 2013. It carried 45 mice, 8 gerbils, 15 geckos, and a collection of snails and fish. And I wish I could tell you that this was some, like, triumphal return for BION, but it wasn't. And to explain why, I'm going to quote from an article in Space Safety magazine titled, "Crew of BION M1 Found Dead Upon Landing." Quote, "It was reported that in an experiment containing 15 mice, the food supply system had failed soon after launch. Other technical failures in various units resulted in only 6 out of 45 mice on board surviving the entire voyage. The geckos were luckier and managed to return to Earth alive, as did all other examined organisms. Evgeny Ilin said the expected mortality rate of animals during the flight was below 5%. The actual figure, at least in the case of BION mammals, is about 75%. What exactly killed the gerbils is currently being investigated. At some point, the flight control system turned off power in the entire unit, stopping oxygen supply, food dispensation, light, and ventilation." So Russia going it alone on BION is significantly more scuffed than any of the previous missions.
I love it.
So like they graduate from rats, they go up to mice and gerbils, and out of 45 mice and 8 gerbils, 6 mice survive. And none of them are meant to die. They all die because of technical failures in the satellite.
Well, I mean, it's sort of what happens when you don't do something for 15 years and come back to it.
Yeah, and also have those approaches to QA that we talked about earlier. So the BION program is still technically running today, although it gets to deal with Roscosmos build quality and chronic Russian underfunding.
And also the fact that there's an active war underway, but that's...
Yeah. Instead of the 2-year launch tempo from when it was a Soviet-American project, BION missions are now scheduled for about 10 years apart. So BION M2 was actually originally supposed to launch in 2023, but at time of recording, it's been delayed back to 2024, and I have no idea when it will actually launch. So that is the story of BION, the first space cooperation, how it died, and the weird program that is wearing its name and continuing to go on today. How do you guys feel?
Continuing the path of senseless bloodshed and slaughtering of small animals.
Yes. And at least with the earlier missions, you could say they were doing it for science. Nowadays, BION is just killing animals because it's actively breaking down and all of the equipment on it is falling apart.
Yes. The only way you would be able to extract any sort of pertinent information is by throwing these satellites out for far, far, far longer terms than current manned satellites are. But then you still have the gap of when you launch them to far surpassing manned.
Maybe not the fun topic that a lot of people clicked on, but I hope there was enough fun stuff along the way.
It's failure to launch. It's not always happy.
Yeah. And listener, we never did promise to be a comedy podcast. Sometimes things are funny, sometimes they're not. We hope you at least learned something along the way and maybe had some fun. Up to you. I'm not your mom.
That PETA is horrible. Space programs can be backwards and outdated, and people can be incredibly stupid.
Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.